Can I welcome everyone to tonight's session on media freedom. This evening we are launching one of the reports which has been produced by the high-level panel, legal panel, that works on the Media Freedom Project. This is a global project that was created 2 years ago now by the British government with the Canadian government. So it was a bilateral enterprise, but the whole intention was that slowly but surely more and more nations around the world would become engaged. And that in fact has been true. A pledge was created to protect media freedom as a vital component in any democracy, and 40 countries have signed that pledge and want to be engaged in this work. The high-level panel was created to do in-depth legal work and research and to create tools which could be harnessed in bringing governments to the table on this issue and to create greater accountability. And that high-level panel is chaired by the former president of the United Kingdom Supreme Court, Lord Neuberger, and the deputy chair is Amal Clooney, who is here with us tonight and will be contributing on this panel. The report that we're going to be launching tonight is about the creation of a new investigative process, and Nadim Houry, who is a very distinguished lawyer of Lebanese origin, he will tell you how the work was done and what it is that he's recommending with regard to the investigation of the terrible crimes that are being committed against journalists. We've seen over the last 2 years, over 100 journalists have been killed, but it isn't just the murder of journalists that's horrifying the world, it's the extent to which journalists are put in fear, they're threatened with violence, there are disappearances, they're thrown in jail on trumped up charges. And so we've been putting together a number of reports to deal with these matters. You have tonight with us Nadim, who will present the report, and I will ask Amal Clooney to direct us towards that part of this meeting. But also we have a number of discussants, eminent lawyers who are going to respond to the report. And also we have Christophe Deloire, who is here from Journalists Without Borders, and Kanbar Hussainbor, who's here from the British government, from the Foreign Office. And so let me welcome Amal. Amal Clooney is a very distinguished British lawyer, and she'll be known to many of you for her groundbreaking work. Amal is, as I said, the deputy chair of the high-level panel. She's a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, and she specializes in international law and human rights. She's ranked one of the top lawyers in the United Kingdom in the field of public international law, international human rights, and international criminal law. Visiting professor at Columbia Law School, and she's represented journalists and the media around the world. From Reuters journalists who were put on trial in Myanmar. She's represented journalists in Egypt. She's representing Maria Ressa just now, who's a Philippines journalist who is on trial. And she's acted in many leading cases. She founded Trial Watch, an initiative to monitor trials. And I'm proud to tell you that she's just won a really fantastic award, which is the Gwen Ifill Award. And it was presented to her by the Committee to Protect Journalists in recognition of her extraordinary and sustained achievement in the cause of press freedom. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to my colleague and friend, Amal Clooney. Amal, over to you.
Helena, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to rejoin this International Bar Association conference and to launch the 4th report of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom here tonight. I spoke earlier in the week about the work of the panel, as Helena said, chaired by Lord Neuberger. And I explained that our focus is on one key issue, which is the enforcement of international human rights law, meaning that we are not trying to change the rules, but to attach real-world consequences to breaking them, so that the guarantee of press freedom in international treaties actually means something to a journalist at risk, and so that we can move from statements to practical solutions. As many of you know, freedom of the press is in crisis around the world today. To cite just a few indicators, more journalists today are killed outside war zones than inside them, not hit by crossfire, but targeted for what they write. Only 1 in 10 of these murders results in a successful prosecution. And across the world, we are seeing a backsliding of democratic values and record numbers of journalists imprisoned simply for telling the truth. Now, the panel has already recommended a number of actions that states can take to improve the protections they provide to the press. We recommend a system of emergency visas for journalists who are at risk of arbitrary arrest or violence and who need to seek refuge abroad. We've argued for a robust system of consular support for journalists, overseen by a new international commissioner. Other advice has focused on punishing the perpetrators. A report that I drafted earlier this year proposes a system of financial sanctions against individuals who are responsible for abuses of the press. And today's report is geared towards developing another potential punishment, building a capacity to properly investigate abuses so that perpetrators can be prosecuted in criminal trials. I'll be honest, our report today is a frustrating read. We document all the instruments that make clear that states have a legal obligation to investigate crimes against journalists. We cite the many declarations, resolutions, task forces, plans, platforms, remembrance days, and workshops that conclude over and over again, year after year, that states must end impunity, states must tackle violent attacks, and states must implement the international legal framework for investigation and prosecution. Yet the conclusion, the real conclusion, is presented in direct terms at paragraph 22 of the report, and it is stark. Quote, "There is little or no political cost to governments and officials that attack journalists or purposely block or undermine investigations into such attacks." You may well have reached this conclusion yourselves when the daytime murder and dismemberment of a Washington Post columnist on foreign soil triggered few meaningful penalties for those involved. Our report today focuses on something new. An international task force created by the 40+ states that have formed the Media Freedom Coalition, as well as other leading democracies that purport to defend freedom of the press. We argue that these states should put their money where their mouth is by creating a team that can investigate violence against journalists. States that are not able to contribute funds can instead offer personnel who could be seconded to the task force when needed, so that when authorities on the ground are too slow, ill-equipped, or politicized to investigate, a roster of pre-vetted, pre-trained experts can be called in instead. Our proposed task force could assist a state like Mexico, in which journalists are being targeted by criminal gangs, but the state lacks the resources to fully investigate them. The task force could support UN rapporteurs who try to investigate journalist attacks, but are seriously hampered by a lack of resources. The UN investigation into the killing of Khashoggi is a case in point, given that, as a member of the team that conducted the investigation put it at paragraph 20 of the report, the investigation was, quote, wholly under-resourced for such a serious crime and cover-up. And the task force could be used to mobilize political pressure on a state like the Philippines, in which journalists are killed with impunity, to allow an investigation on its territory. The report also calls for publication of a list revealing the states with the worst records. This would not only name and supposedly shame, but impose specific consequences, such as sanctions, that should attach to inclusion on the list. And specific steps, including credible investigations and prosecutions, would be required to come off the list. My fellow panelist, Nadim, Houry, a brilliant lawyer who for many years led human rights investigations for Human Rights Watch in the Middle East, is the principal drafter of the report, and he will explain these recommendations in a bit more detail. But let me just conclude by saying that it is clear that if we do nothing, the international response to attacks on press freedom will remain the same, uneven and rarely effective. And impunity will continue to be the norm. Now, our recommendations are not the best case scenario or the gold standard. They are designed to be realistic, achievable proposals that will help to move things forward if the governments that say they support media freedom actually mean it. The system that we describe is not the ideal world, but it would be a very clear improvement on what we have in place today. And states' responses to our recommendations will reveal whether they are interested in making statements or in actually finding solutions to one of the most urgent threats to democracy we are facing today. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to our discussion. Let me now hand it over to the drafter of the report, Mr. Nadim Houry.
Nadim.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Baroness Kennedy. Thank you very much, Amal. It's really an honor and privilege to be with you tonight. The premise of this report is in some ways simple and yet deeply troubling. And it really starts with three facts, and I think Amal started hinting at them. Fact number one, almost 90% of killings of journalists go unpunished. And here we're talking about killings, not the other forms of attacks and harassment that journalists are seeing every day. I think we have to take a moment to reflect on that number, 90% of killings. The second fact is that this rampant impunity is not limited to countries experiencing armed conflict or just a general collapse of the rule of law. This is not just your Syria, your Iraq, or your Afghanistan. As Amal mentioned, actually, since 2017, most killings of journalists are occurring outside of war zones and increasingly in places previously considered safe for journalists, like Malta, like a consulate in Turkey. Fact number three is that the situation is not getting better, despite the multiple and important initiatives that we have seen at the international, regional, and local level in recent years. And I think this is really the troubling aspect, is that since 2013, and I use 2013 because this is when the UN General Assembly officially proclaimed an International Day to end impunity for crimes against journalists, there has been a proliferation of reports, UN resolutions, and despite the increased attention, we keep seeing the curve of attacks on journalists increasing, and we keep seeing that dreadful number of successful investigations and prosecutions extremely low. So based on these facts, these three clear facts, this report really set out to answer two questions. Why are so few investigations into attacks on journalists succeeding and leading to prosecution? And B, and perhaps more importantly, what can be done to finally start tackling the issue? Now, in trying to answer these questions, I have to say we were greatly helped by the amazing work done by so many NGOs, UN agencies, from UNESCO to special rapporteurs, who have been doing painstaking work to document attacks on journalists and monitor progress of investigations. We were able to consult with them, and we were able to look at the data and to try to get to an answer. And what comes out is really two types of reasons for the ongoing impunity. And I don't think they will come as a surprise to you. One is lack of capacity. In many, many cases, we see local authorities not having the capacity, the know-how, the resources to protect the crime scene, to gather new forms of evidence like digital evidence, to exploit forensic evidence, and also to question powerful suspects. But more often than not, what kept coming of all the analysis of these cases was a lack of political will. In many cases, the authorities were simply unwilling to really investigate. Now, why, could one ask? It's because journalists, particularly good journalists, tend to bother those in power. And often behind the attacks lie powerful actors. And I think this is the key difference between a regular crime on the street and an attack on a journalist. When you start looking at investigations into attacks on journalists, you realize that there are powerful interests at every step of the way trying to block the investigation and later trying to block the prosecution. What we're seeing are no ordinary crimes. So then the question is, how do you break this vicious circle? Now, one approach would have been to simply say, well, we need to train local enforcement, build up local capacity. Sure, I think this is important, and this is taking place in a number of countries. But we know that these sorts of efforts take years, if not decades. And frankly, in the countries where we have seen such efforts of trying to train policemen, trying to train prosecutors, the results have been underwhelming. And unfortunately, we do not have the luxury of time. We need to act now. And so the main recommendation of this report, which both Baroness Kennedy and Amal were mentioning, is a clear call to set up a standing investigative task force made of vetted and trained investigators, forensic experts, legal specialists that can quickly deploy to crime scenes to support investigations. Now, what sort of investigations? They might be able to support national investigations. They could also support, and we're seeing that in a number of regions in the world, regional investigations set up by regional mechanisms. They can support UN mechanisms when they are on the ground as well investigating. But also in some cases, such a standing task force could support the work of NGO-led investigations, which we'll talk about a bit later, I'm sure, where we're seeing more and more NGOs leading the sort of criminal evidence gathering efforts. Now, sending international experts to conduct criminal investigations or assisting existing efforts has really proven effective in overcoming local capacity issues in many contexts. If you think about countering terrorism or cross-border organized crime. But these deployments, particularly when done in an ad hoc manner, often require lengthy negotiations, logistical buildup, which ultimately reduces their effectiveness. Matter of fact is, by the time the investigators, the international experts are deployed, much of the evidence has already disappeared. And we haven't seen such efforts being coordinated effectively to tackle the plague that is impunity for attacks against journalists. Now, where should this investigative task force exist institutionally? Now, ideally, a standing international task force dealing with a global problem would exist with a UN mandate. And the high-level panel and the report joins the growing number of voices calling for a permanent investigative body within the UN system. But we recognize, the panel recognizes that, and I have to say here, regrettably, the creation of a permanent UN body, investigative body, does not seem to currently have sufficient political support. We hope that this will change in the near future, but until such time, we need to provide an alternative. We need to provide concrete answers to the ongoing impunity. And this is why the report recommends that the 40+ countries that have formed the Media Freedom Coalition, and by joining this coalition, they pledged, they promised to quote unquote work together to protect media freedom. We call on them to set up a multilateral investigative task force that would have these international experts and could deploy very, very quickly. Now, such a task force created by a coalition of the committed would actually have a number of key strengths. One, given that they are all gathered around the same principles, it would be less susceptible to the current blockages we have seen in recent years at the UN. It also means that any deployment should be able to happen faster and frankly with less compromises. Two, the fact that it would be created by a large group of countries from different parts of the world including many regional champions of media freedom, means that such a group would have the political credibility and the access to the deep pool of talent that no other unilateral or even bilateral initiative would have. Because when we're looking at sort of the precedents, we have seen in a number of cases, potentially the FBI gets deployed. And that's very important. Or maybe Dutch investigators get deployed. Again, I think this is great. But what we are proposing here is to go beyond that. Because while the FBI may have all the technical skills in the world, they may not have the regional know-how. They may not have the linguistic access, or they may not sufficiently understand a local judicial system to really be able to provide all the necessary advice for the investigation. And the third advantage of this international multitask investigative task force would be that it would come to complement existing mechanisms. The idea here is to build on existing UN regional and national initiatives and investigations. And in an interview for this report with Professor David Kaye, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, he noted that through his many fact-finding missions as Special Rapporteurs, one of the key challenges he saw was the lack of access to investigative support when he needed it, which often was on very short notice. And the importance, he added, of access to quickly deployable investigators, from people like forensic specialists to digital experts, would have made his work as UN Special Rapporteur even more impactful. And I think this is the flexibility of this tool of supporting the different types of investigations that can happen today. Now, what would it be required to ensure the success of such a task force? And I think here we have three key criteria. First is, and I think Amal put it very eloquently, that signatories to the Global Pledge have to put their money where their mouth is. They need to commit sufficient financial resources to the task force to allow it to operate effectively and sustainably. But frankly, whatever resources they would have to commit, we believe it will be a small price to pay for ending impunity for attacks against journalists. Because as the report makes it very clear, what we are dealing with here is not just attacks on journalists, but actually attacks on democracy and democratic principles. And every time a journalist is killed, we need to ask ourselves, how many others are silenced or pushed into self-censorship or exile? It would be a very small price to pay for such an effort. And in a case, a particular signatory country, because we know in the group of almost 40 countries, some may be unable to commit funds, they should at the very least make available qualified nationals to assist the task force at no cost. And here again, we could see areas of expertise could include criminal investigators, perhaps forensic digital experts, specialist interviewers, lawyers, and this sort of in-kind support, we have seen it with UN peacekeeping, and it can work well if there's a real political desire to make such an initiative work. And finally, as an element of success for this task force would be to commit, each country would commit to use their political advocacy, both in bilateral, but also in multilateral contexts, to facilitate the work of the task force, and notably the access of the investigators and the work of the investigators once they get access to the crime scene. Now, who could host such a task force? And when we were thinking of that, we thought, well, it has to be an organization with the global reach, with the independence, and with the right convening power to be able to bring together all these required skills and to be able to, motivate states to keep acting. And when I look at even today such a meeting, and when I see the wide range of people that the IBA is able to gather and the caliber of people, it became a natural candidate that it should be the International Bar Association, which already is acting as the secretariat for the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, and is basically the pioneer to promote human rights and the rule of law, that it would be the natural candidate for the IBA to host such an investigative task force. Now, the report also makes two other sets of recommendations that I will run through quickly. One, the report takes note that in recent years, we have really seen many NGOs expand their work to include gathering evidence for purposes of criminal investigation. This became increasingly visible in war zones, where often NGOs and their staff are much quicker to deploy than international investigators, but also through the way NGOs and different civil society initiatives have really seized upon the opportunities of open source investigation techniques. And in a very short amount of time, these efforts have opened new possibilities for holding perpetrators accountable, including at places like the International Criminal Court. Now, this is a very exciting opportunity, but also raises a number of questions around the ability of NGOs to do, collection of physical or forensic evidence. Do they have the right training? Can they maintain a chain of custody of evidence? Can they protect witnesses they speak to? What about things like re-traumatizing witnesses? These are all key questions that need answers, and NGOs engaged in evidence gathering efforts related to attacks on journalists should adopt best practices, be they ethical principles or investigation guidelines, in their efforts to investigate attacks on journalists. Now, luckily, there have been a number of important initiatives in recent years developing such guidelines. And our recommendation here is on states who have signed the Global Pledge on Media Freedom to support and fund efforts to disseminate these best practices for collecting and sharing evidence between NGOs and UN and judicial institutions, and support capacity building initiatives for local groups, particularly those working on investigating attacks on journalists in countries with rampant impunity. Now, the third set of recommendations goes back to the central question of how do you raise the political cost for inaction? Because we can no longer just satisfy ourselves with more resolutions or more statements. And today, as Amal was mentioning, we are seeing no political cost to governments or officials that actually attack journalists or purposely block or undermine investigations. Now, as strong believers in international law and in international institutions, naturally, we address a number of these recommendations to strengthen the UN response. Now, what happens today in the UN? And there are almost 20 to 30 pages in the report describing the different mechanisms. But in short, the UN Secretary General and other UN mechanisms report periodically to the Security Council, the General Assembly, or even the Human Rights Council about attacks on journalists. But that's it. There is nothing tying this reporting to specific actions. Now, one way to overcome this would be to ask the UN Secretary General to develop a list of the worst violators of journalists' rights and present it to the Security Council if the Security Council is seized of the matter, or in other cases to the General Assembly. This could be done very easily based on the very helpful indices that have been created by NGOs like the Committee to Protect Journalists or Reporters Without Borders, as well as the important monitoring and reporting done by UN institutions from UNESCO to UNOHCHR, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. This list of the worst violators would then be tied to specific consequences. Being on the list would be tied to specific consequences on a graduated range, going all the way to targeted financial sanctions against those more responsible. And once you're on that list, there will be specific milestone to be removed from it, including where appropriate, allowing the UN to effectively investigate attacks on journalists. Now, did we just come up with such a system? Is this impossible? No, the UN already has such a system in place for countries and groups that are the worst violators of rights of children in armed conflict. This sort of list tied to actual consequences already exists in the toolbox of the US, and it has been described by many advocacy groups as a powerful tool for change over the years. Just to give you an example, so this list used for child soldiers, there have been 32 countries and armed groups that have been listed and have had action plans developed after being put on the list. And of those, 12 parties, including state and non-state actors, have fully complied with their commitment and were subsequently delisted. This is concrete improvement. And we believe that to help raise profile for existing efforts, it is essential that the countries that have supported the media pledge push the UN to start adopting such a list. And to make that effort more sustainable, to raise the profile within the UN, we also join the existing calls by civil society, and I'm sure that my colleague Antoine from RSF will dwell more on it, to create a new high-level UN Special Representative for Journalists and Human Rights Defenders Safety that would act as a focal point, politically engaged in advancing accountability for crimes against journalists, and would facilitate the work of the other UN mechanisms and institutions. Now, on the way forward, I apologize, actually Christophe's going to be speaking about that. My apologies, Christophe. On the way forward, the Global Pledge on Media Freedom recognized that in the face of threats to media freedom that are new in scale and in nature, and I'm quoting here, we must adopt new forms of collaboration that adapt to new realities. And it is this report's conclusion that any successful effort will require increased collaboration and innovation because business as usual is no longer enough. And the cornerstone of any effort to end impunity is actually quite simple when you think of it. It's getting investigators to crime scenes as fast as possible. And after reviewing all that has been written over the recent years on that, we have found that the best way to do so is to have a standing investigative task force with sufficient political backing that can deploy the right skills to the crime scene at the right moment, and they can get their job done. This is the only way for us to start rolling back these atrocious figures that I started my presentation with today. Thank you very much.
Nadim, that was so interesting. And I hope those who are listening, recognizing what a substantial piece of work this is, and how you've really struggled with seeking to create something that would realistically deal with the, if you like, the fragmented nature of evidence gathering, the failure to have proper investigative processes and so on. Now, let me make it clear. The IBA is deeply flattered that you've made it as part of your recommendations that it should be the IBA, but any other global, I think it has to be a global organization. Any other global organization could be a contender to do this. It could be the International Commission of Jurists or some other organization. But what it's fair to say that I think you've had the experience of our running the Secretariat for the Global Media Freedom project, and it is true that the IBA has a great deal of experience in running task force and in doing this kind of work, which is, you know, I think where there is a level of a real expertise here. But the idea is the main thing, not the location. And let's just think about the idea of this and the reasons why it is so necessary. And I'm going to now invite in some of our panel to contribute to this a discussion about your report. Let me first of all go to Christophe, because Christophe, you are the Director General of Reporters Sans Frontières, and you share you're going to share RSF's perspective. You know, I mean, the real concern being about impunity, the ways in which it's so hard to nail down those who are the serious offenders here, and how do you address the attacks on journalists that have been taking place? I was one of the people who went with Agnes Kalamar to Turkey to attend with her as part of the little group of experts that she put around her when she went to look at the evidence that there was of the killing of Khashoggi. And it was wholly inadequate. You know, it really was. If I hadn't been there because the International Bar Association funded my presence there, paid for me to go and so on, so that she did, because she had no resource. She had no resource. She was assisted by a sort of a very committed forensics specialist who really is a forensic pathologist who has done many human rights cases for the IBA, and he came and attended for us. We found a retired policeman who came, a British retired policeman. But it really was boxing and coxing and trying to put together something on a shoestring without very much notice and so on. And it was not how something should be done with a high level of professionalism. So I really wanted you to come in now with all your expertise of the problems here, the problems of impunity, and help us with why something has to be brought into existence of the kind that Nadim has described.
Thank you, Baroness, and I will also comment this extraordinary report by the high-level panel and by Nadim himself. So dear Amal, dear Nadim and friends, so I would like to thank the organizers for convening this meeting on the occasion of the launch of the report on promoting more effective investigations on abuses against journalists. Of course, we extend our warm congratulations to the panel on its rapporteur, Nadim, for this report. Nadim mentioned it when he spoke just a few minutes ago. We do not have the luxury of time. This is true. This is even obvious, but I'm not sure that all the consequences are drawn or were drawn until now. And I really hope that this report will allow consequences to be drawn. This report is timely. It is beyond time to remedy a collective failure embodied in one figure that Nadim also mentioned, an impunity rate of more than 80% of crimes against journalists. The panel's report is based on a thorough analysis of an unacceptable situation, existing international standards, mechanisms, and mobilization efforts have not succeeded in effectively imposing costs for the murders of journalists. The report is pertinent. Only such forward-looking recommendations as tabled in this report can help provide answers that would be proportionate to the needs. The justice vacuum indeed inspired us at RSF to launch in September last year, an unprecedented initiative, our Justice for Journalists Task Force, aimed at initiating and supporting investigations into prosecution and sanction of crimes against journalists. Indeed, Reporters Without Borders, RSF, decided to move beyond ensuring necessary legal support to victims and families, fighting back for justice and accordingly developing evidence gathering, as well as implementing a litigation strategy. This includes investigating, triggering, and interacting with prosecutors, police, and investigating judges in different states, as well as before international and regional courts and tribunals, up to legal representation of victims and entering itself as a legal person into proceedings when appropriate. Moving such lines as the ones shielding perpetrators from their individual criminal accountability is a tough and dangerous endeavor for NGOs involved. Strong and sustained support to our efforts is needed as the report adequately recommends to prioritize. We at RSF welcome this unprecedented interest in and attention to NGO incriminatory investigation involvement. It's clear that such efforts toward perpetrators' accountability falls within the primary responsibility of states as per their international obligations. Yet in most situations, inability and unwillingness to investigate abuses against journalists are at play. RSF welcomes, accordingly, the recommendation aiming at the creation of a permanent investigative task force, ideally within the UN, to support efforts by states, regional organizations and NGOs. Existing interstates backed up initiatives such as the Justice Rapid Response already offer on-demand opportunities for support. Obviously, there is a drastic need to move further with the creation of a standing body as recommended by the report. RSF particularly welcomes the panel's endorsement of our call to establish a UN special representative on the safety of journalists. Given the endemic impunity for the vast majority of killings of journalists globally, totaling nearly 1,000 cases over the past decade, it is time now for actions, not just words, to ensure accountability for these horrific crimes and help protect journalists going forward. This special representative mandate would not just be a paper-based exercise that will result in more reporting in Geneva. It would be a means of bringing together all of the existing mechanisms, resolutions, and recommendations of UN bodies and ensuring meaningful coordination and implementation to begin to impose actual accountability for crimes committed against journalists everywhere. It would ensure that good intentions do not just remain intentions or resolutions remain just fictions in the future, but real life implications. It could support the creation of a permanent investigative body and follow up on other recommendations from the panel. It could help concretize the draft guidelines for prosecutors brought together by the International Association of Prosecutors that RSF supported. The panel's support will help significantly in building momentum towards making this proposal for a special representative a reality. And now, in turn, we need the active support of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. With just over a year remaining in his first term in office, it is time for him to fulfill his promise and take concrete action to establish his position and ensure his legacy is one of protecting journalists and ending impunity, not inaction in the face of a growing global crisis. We hope the panel will help us convey this message to Mr. Guterres. Moreover, RSF supports the recommendation that a UN-based annual list of worst perpetrators be published, building on the experience of the list concerning child soldiers. Albeit seen by some as confrontational, it is mostly by poorly ranked states. More importantly, this worst perpetrator list would provide a clear periodic highlight on the issue and an avenue for frank dialogue that has been missing dramatically. We cannot anymore satisfy ourselves with however necessary celebrations. Words urgently need to be followed with action and turned into facts. This is the panel's report. Invite. RSF is honored to endorse the panel's recommendations and urges all interested parties to mobilize so as to turn them into realities.
Christophe, having the endorsement of your organization, Reporters Without Borders, is so important to us, and having your personal endorsement as someone with so much experience. So I want to thank you for coming and joining us tonight and for contributing to this important debate about how do we give teeth to international law? How do we really find enforcement mechanisms that will work? I'm now going to bring in, I mentioned that we had some distinguished lawyers with us, and I'm going to now introduce to you Kaye Gallagher. Kaye is also a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers and specialises in human rights. She's acted in many of the landmark cases in the United Kingdom, including acting for bereaved families who were survivors of the 7/7 bombing in London, the Hillsborough disaster. She led the case in the Supreme Court for reproductive freedom in Northern Ireland, and that women have the right to have terminations of pregnancies. She has got particular expertise in this field concerning the safety of journalists and accountability for journalists' deaths. She's given evidence actually before Parliament on these issues. She is leading the international legal team for the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was the great investigative journalist who was blown up, murdered brutally in Malta, and whose sons are busily campaigning on her behalf for justice. She is also has been acting for the family of Christopher Allen, who is the UK-US dual citizen who was killed, a journalist who was killed in South Sudan. She's a leading counsel acting for 152 BBC Persian service journalists in Iran who've been persecuted there. For Amal Fati, a blogger of women's rights from Egypt, and she and Jan, whom you're going to hear from shortly, and Amal are all leading an international legal team for Maria Ressa, the award-winning journalist in the Philippines, who's being seriously persecuted by the powers that be there. So Kaye, over to you. You've had a chance of looking at the report, and we were anxious to sort of hear your views, given your expertise in this field too.
Thank you very much, Helena. And thank you to all the speakers beforehand. And thank you. I've had an opportunity to look at the report today, and it's a hugely impressive piece of work. From my perspective, journalism has never been more important, but in many ways, it has also never been more dangerous. Journalists, as you've heard from the previous speakers, are under attack like never before, although the risks are morphing and changing, as this report reflects. Now, I, like many on the panel, see this in my work every day, representing journalists at risk around the world and bereaved families of journalists killed simply for doing their jobs. And you'll see on the cover of the report that two of the bereaved families that I represent have their loved ones featured on the cover, Daphne Caruana Galizia and Christopher Allen. And although their cases are in many ways very different, one an award-winning investigative journalist assassinated in a car bomb in a European country, one a brave freelance war reporter and photojournalist killed on 26th of August 2017 whilst working as a journalist in South Sudan. What they have in common is that they were both journalists killed due to their work. Their deaths occurred in 2017, 3 years ago. And in both cases, there is as yet no conviction of the perpetrators, let alone wider accountability for their deaths or the underlying circumstances which allowed their deaths to occur, which in both cases involve a culture of impunity, albeit quite different forms of a culture of impunity. Now, accountability and justice for the bereaved families of journalists I represent takes many forms. For all of my clients, without fail, criminal accountability is critical. Robust, independent investigations and resulting prosecutions of the foot soldiers, but also prosecution of the intellectual masterminds, those pulling the strings. Now, many of the families I represent also see accountability for their loved ones in a broader sense, encompassing, for example, the need for investigations into questions of state responsibility, where the perpetrators may be non-state actors, but there are questions about whether there was preventability for the attacks and whether state authorities should have known that there was a real and immediate risk to life and should have taken more steps proactively to protect them, learning lessons from deaths to ensure protective steps are taken to ensure other journalists are not placed at such risk, and often ongoing work on the underlying subject matter of the very journalism for which they were killed. And Matthew Caruana Galizia, my brave client, puts it this way: there is no way you can separate impunity from my mother's murder itself and impunity from the harassment for the corruption that she was investigating. But at its most basic, every single bereaved family of a journalist who I represent expect a criminal investigation in compliance with international standards. And what this report documents is a total failure across the board in democratic countries and in dictatorships to comply with that basic requirement when people have their loved one killed simply for doing their jobs. Now, as you've heard from previous speakers, in recent years, there's been a drop in the number of journalists killed in conflict zones, and the classic image of a foreign war correspondent in a press flak jacket and helmet killed in a conflict zone simply no longer encapsulates the nature and scale of the threats faced by journalists. And you've heard from Amal and Nadim about how more journalists are killed in non-conflict zones in so-called peacetime than in war zones. But those two examples from the cover of the report are very powerful because they illustrate precisely why many of these proposals in the report are so important. So let me start with Christopher Allen. In conflict zones, those most at risk now, in my experience, and according to the statistics, are local reporters and bloggers whose deaths never hit the international headlines, or freelancers unsupported by media organizations and support structures. And Christopher Allen, importantly, was a freelancer. He didn't have a big media organization behind him, and he doesn't have a big media organization advocating for justice in his case. And that's critical, and another very important factor supporting the proposal in this report for an investigative task force as a fallback when states fail to comply with their basic obligations. So he was killed 3 years ago, as I've said. He was the first foreign journalist to be killed in the South Sudan conflict. And importantly, he was a dual US-UK national. In fact, his parents currently are preparing for what would have been his 30th birthday. He was killed when he was in his mid-20s, an incredibly talented young journalist who was operating as a freelancer. And 3 years on, there's been no justice whatsoever. There's been no official investigation into the killers or the circumstances of his killing by the South Sudanese authorities or any other law enforcement agency anywhere in the world. And it's important to emphasize the circumstances of his case. So Christopher Allen, we have seen from the material before us, credible evidence that 2 war crimes were committed in Christopher Allen's case. Firstly, there is credible evidence suggesting that he may have been targeted specifically because he was a journalist. He was carrying his camera at the time. We have material from his camera, from the photographs that he was taking immediately before he was killed, and from whistleblowers who've spoken to other investigative journalists. And we also have the pattern of bullets in his body, and we have the evidence of his body, which suggests that he was targeted from behind while carrying a camera with his camera raised, where it was quite clear that he was a journalist and not a member of the group, the armed group who was present. We had a flurry of statements from South Sudan, initially claiming this was a crossfire death, and then promptly a withdrawal and an apology. And so we've had that very early on, but there's been no investigation. Now, the fact that there's been no investigation by South Sudan may not surprise many of you on this Zoom call, but very importantly, there's been no investigation either by either of his 2 states of nationality. So I mentioned that he's a US national, credible evidence of war crimes. And in fact, in the US, of course, it is a crime under domestic law in the US when a war crime is committed against a US national. Why? Many months, over a year, since we wrote to the FBI and requested them to investigate his case, why is there no US investigation? So this is a very powerful example where the state itself, where Christopher Allen was killed, has failed to comply with its international obligations. Why have Christopher Allen's 2 states of nationality not stepped in to fill that gap, particularly in circumstances where, as a US national, this was also an arguable breach of domestic law? Now, I mentioned the first crime was the circumstances in which he was killed. The second suspected war crime relates to the fact that his body was defiled after his death, and photographs were circulated and posted online of his body in a state of unclothing, trophy photographs. And it is quite clear that that is also a war crime which requires investigation. So a year after we wrote to the FBI, and the family have yet to have any form of substantive response to that correspondence, rather shockingly, we wrote in August 2019. In August 2020, Agnes Callamard, the UN Special Rapporteur in extrajudicial killings, who you've heard about already and who Helena, of course, has worked with on Jamal Khashoggi's case, she considered our material, suggesting there's reasonable cause to suspect that there may have been 2 war crimes committed here, both in respect of the killing and the photographs of the body. And she made a statement in August 2020 saying this: the fact that for 3 whole years there's been no independent investigation into Mr. Allen's killing sends a very dangerous signal that journalists and media workers can be targeted with impunity. 3 years is too long to leave a bereaved family without answers. Investigation into crimes committed against journalists, not only in South Sudan, but around the world, is a key element in preventing future attacks and ending impunity. The governments of South Sudan and the United States can and must take steps to ensure that the circumstances of Mr. Allen's murder are fully, independently, and fearlessly investigated. Now, our view is Christopher was a brave journalist who told the stories many others did not. His reporting in South Sudan shone a much needed spotlight on suffering of the South Sudanese people during wartime. His killing is not only a deep personal loss to his family, my clients, it's also an attack upon the fundamental right to freedom of expression and the right of journalists to be protected when reporting on armed conflicts. And it's also, frankly, an affront to the public in South Sudan and around the world who were entitled to hear his reporting. There's reasonable cause to suspect war crimes were committed against Christopher. Why do we have a situation where the state where he was killed and the US have failed to investigate? And there can be no more powerful example of the value of the recommendation in this powerful report for the setting up of an international investigative task force to step in. Now, what Agnes Callamard has done is superb. She has stepped in as a special rapporteur to take action in this case. But what she's been limited to doing is essentially a desk-based review, looking at the materials. So it's obviously no substitute for a full criminal investigation. The second case I want to mention before I conclude is, as you've heard, I act for the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia as part of an international team of lawyers based in London and Valletta. And the remarkable woman who's at the heart of our work is, of course, someone who I've never met. It's something that many of us who act for bereaved families have. The person who's the most important person in the room is simply not there and not someone we can ever meet. But in the past 3 years, I've learned much about her through her 3 brave, tenacious sons, her husband, Peter, and many journalists she mentored and inspired. I've learned she was the first woman to write a political column in Malta, the first to use her own name rather than write anonymously. I know she broke every single major story since 1988 in Malta, when she was aged only 24 and had just given birth to her son, Paul, her youngest child. I know she never betrayed a confidence, even when her life was in danger. Also a critical aspect of accountability with investigations, because there are freedom of expression concerns about source protection in handing over her materials to the very state authorities whose corruption she was investigating. And a year before her death, she wrote that her sons had known nothing else all their lives. They grew up thinking, she said, it was completely normal to have your mother's name all over the newspapers and on the tips of politicians' tongues, to have your house set on fire, to have police at your gate, either to guard your mother or arrest her, to have her check the underside of her car for bombs before taking you to school, to answer the home telephone to find some anonymous nut job spouting obscenities at you when you're only 8 years old, to find parcels of human excrement in the post. Now, I've also, of course, had the privilege of learning more about Daphne from her searing, no-holds-barred, brilliant writing, and many of you here will have read some of that. But it's very important that we recognize this about Daphne's case. Daphne's case is sometimes described as being very shocking and being a bolt from the blue. But this was not a bolt from the blue. This was a predictable killing. The material was clear. She spoke about it and wrote about it beforehand. And rather like circumstances where freak weather events happen more often when the climate itself is degrading, this is an example of what many people see as a bolt from the blue, a freak event happening because of a culture of impunity, which allowed her to go through those sustained attacks over a long period of time. Now, her sons immediately, and her husband, immediately after this happened, I've been acting for them since the first number of weeks, thanks in fact to Christophe Deloire's organisation. I'm on the UK board of RSF, and I met them very early on with RSF, who've been an amazing support to this family throughout that time. And they immediately said, we're in a European country, we don't want to get a win in the European Court of Human Rights in 6 years' time, which tells us that there was a failure to comply with the investigative obligation. We want an investigation now before the trail goes cold. And it's a really powerful example, I think, of the importance of cross-border support, because the crimes which Daphne was investigating, the corruption she was investigating, was cross-border, transcended borders. She was investigating state authorities. And we were in a position in 2017 where the key individuals who were involved in investigating her death were the subject matter of her reporting. And it took us a full year before we managed to get the chief of police responsible for investigating her case off the case on grounds of apparent bias. It took us a year. So the report documents here how there was support which came in from international organizations, for which we were very grateful, of course, and from police forces in other countries. But they were ultimately under the directorship of a police chief who subsequently was removed from the case 12 months later because it was inappropriate for him to lead a case into her death when he himself had a connection to the circumstances, or a suspected connection to the circumstances. And that again is a hugely powerful example. We simply cannot have a situation where investigations, criminal investigations, are either conducted by those who are the subject matter of the investigative reporting, which is the reason for the death in the first place, or maybe the reason for the death in the first place. And secondly, within state boundaries, organizations operating using Victorian era tools, instead of having a recognition that these are often trans-border crimes, international crimes, and the state where the crimes occurred is simply not the right state to be conducting this. So for all of those reasons, I very much welcome this report today. This is criminal accountability, as I said, is part of the mechanism that all of the bereaved families I act for seek. It's a very important part. In the vast majority of these cases, they don't have it. And I think that this report is a very powerful tool in the armory, and I strongly support it. Thank you.
Keelan, as someone who really is at the front line doing this work and acting for the families of people of journalists who've lost their lives, that was a really important and powerful statement about why this report is so important. Now, I want to introduce everyone to John Yaginsu, who's also a barrister. He's also a member of the high-level panel. I have the great privilege of often listening to him as a member of that panel. And he is a practitioner in London. He has been consistently recognised as one of the UK's leading lawyers and practices in civil liberties and human rights and international law. And Jan has appeared in many of the significant cases, too many for me to be able to recount to you all. But most important of all is that he, as well as being having academic pursuits and teaching at Columbia Law School and at Georgetown Law School in Washington, he has done many important cases involving journalist freedom. And he's currently the International Counsel with Amal and Keelan, acting for Maria Ressa, the journalist I spoke of, who was arrested in the Philippines and who has been persecuted for years there now. He's also the counsel for Wikimedia Foundation in the European Court of Human Rights currently. So can I ask you, Jan, you've been involved on the panel, and this is a high-level panel of lawyers from all around the world, from South Korea, from Pakistan, from Russia, from all manner of places, and so you've seen the work, and you've been yourself led on one of the reports, as Nadim has led on this one. What is your view about the importance of having this kind of task force that can rather more speedily than the processes that are currently available might operate on? What is your view?
Thank you very much for that question, Helena, and thank you very much for having me today, and thank you to the IBA. Helena, before I come on to the recommendation, I just want to recognize that this is, on any view, an absolutely stunning report by Nadim Houry on behalf of the high-level panel. And I say it's stunning for a number of reasons, but the first is that it highlights all too, or makes all too real, the very scandal of impunity in the 21st century. We've heard about and read about and remain concerned about Jamal Khashoggi's brutal, but also, as Keelan pointed to, the killing of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the fact that the majority of crimes against journalists are still going unpunished, as Christoph said. But the report tries to do something that's very, very difficult to do in this area, tries to provide proposals for action. And Nadim has provided them. We have endorsed those proposals. But I think we need to recognize that this is an extremely difficult area to do that, to propose action. Because here, as in other areas of the work that we've undertaken as a panel, we see an enormous chasm between, on the one hand, well-settled legal obligation, and on the other, the ugly reality of inaction. I mean, the position in international law is clear. Under Article 2, subsection 2 of the International Covenant, states are under a legal obligation to investigate allegations of violations of rights under the Covenant. And that duty to investigate brings with it a concomitant obligation that any such investigation must be independent, impartial, prompt, thorough, effective, credible, and of course, transparent. But when it comes to journalists who've suffered harm, we face this ugly reality that Nadim has explained tonight and that he's made very clear in the content of his report. Christoph reminded us of that ugly statistic. Over 80% of cases that concern the killing of a journalist remain unresolved. Nadim called this today, and also in his report, rampant impunity. And he's absolutely right to use that term. And the serious concern, as Amal Clooney pointed to, is that this impunity exists, notwithstanding the fact that there have been numerous resolutions and decisions to promote the safety of journalists from the UN Security Council, from the UN General Assembly, from the UN Human Rights Council, and from UNESCO. And those are just the initiatives at the UN level. Witness then the regional initiatives that Nadim has documented in his report at the level of the African Union or the African Commission, the Council of Europe, the European Union, the OSCE, the Organization of American States, and the Inter-American Commission. And yet the attacks on journalists are only increasing. So something has to be done. And Nadim's report proposes, as we've heard, the establishment of an international task force, as well as very important measures that Nadim points to support non-governmental organizations working in this area, as well as measures to strengthen the United Nations capacity to hold the worst violators accountable. There's a theme in this report which I want to pick up on, and that's the theme of transparency, the issue of transparency. Nadim and I have had an opportunity to discuss this element in some detail together whilst he was leading the panel's efforts on this report. And some of the fruits of that discussion and some of the fruits of that collaboration are in the report. Investigations must be transparent, and that's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of legal obligation. But that transparency theme cuts across a great deal of the work that we've been undertaking on the panel and that we're going to continue to be undertaking on the panel. And I think that should come as no surprise. I mean, in the domain of media freedom, which is our remit as a panel, the transparency principle is absolutely critical. First, it's critical for the ability of journalists to report in their efforts to hold the powerful or our political masters to account. But secondly, it's plainly critical that we know when a state uses its powers to target journalists, whether it's by way of criminal investigation, whether it's by way of bringing criminal charges or a criminal conviction. The public must have access to those prosecutorial and judicial processes, and the media must be able to report them freely. And thirdly, as Nadim's report establishes so persuasively, the transparency principle is critical to any meaningful attempts to investigate abuses against journalists that have already taken place. And it's a key element in the fight against the scandal of impunity that we've all heard about today. And as Amal Clooney said by way of opening, this panel's already made concrete and detailed proposals for the protection of journalists. We've advised in one voice, and we've advised with broad support. Sanctions for those who target journalists, robust consular assistance to those journalists targeted for their work, an emergency visa and pathways to safe refuge for journalists at risk for their work. And now, an international investigative task force and the attendant mechanisms to make that task force practical and effective. So I just want to close by looking forward, and in particular by looking forward to our continuing work on the application of the transparency principle to protect journalists. Criminal proceedings and investigations against journalists must, as a matter of general proposition, be conducted in public and be a matter of public record. Journalists must know the reasons why they are being held pre-charge or pre-trial. Journalists and their lawyers must be given access to the evidence allegedly being used to deprive them of their liberty. And not only must the state investigate crimes committed against journalists, but they must prosecute. And if they choose not to do so, they must tell us why. So states must be held to account if they take measures to target journalists. Nadim's report on behalf of the high-level panel provides deep analysis on a very specific part of that transparency obligation. But I hope that we can continue to discuss transparency in our work going forward. Thank you very much indeed.
Now, time is getting much tighter, and I want to give Amal an opportunity of coming back in. But Kanbar, I want to introduce you to everybody because you've been a very important ally in all of this. Kanbar Hussainbar is the UK coordinator of the Global Media Freedom Campaign, and so he's there based in the British Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, but he is very much the person in charge of coordinating the different nations who are engaged with this on behalf of the United Kingdom. And so, Kanbar, you're now a sort of lawyer diplomat. Perhaps you'd like to come in and comment on the report. I don't know if you've had the chance to really delve into it. You've got a lot on your plate at the moment, I would imagine.
Firstly, thank you very much, Baroness Kennedy, for that introduction. Also, a good evening to everyone, and wherever you are, good morning and good afternoon as well. First and foremost, I want to thank the high-level legal panel for the work that you are doing. It's quite critical. Taking a step back, unfortunately, the trajectory about harm to journalists and the threats they face is going in the wrong direction. And as we've already heard by other members of the panel this evening, it's shocking that, as the UN says, 9 out of 10 times the murder of journalists goes unpunished. As you know, more broadly, the UK strongly supports the work of the high-level legal panel. We believe that your work, and it's a truly global enterprise insofar as ensuring that representation from across the world is encapsulated in your advice. Your work is critical to ensuring that states are held accountable to the standards that we aspire, and also try and see what steps can be taken to improve the domestic legal environment for journalism, and in particular the safety of journalists. As you may know, we have responded very proactively with respect to your report of the high-level legal panel on sanctions. The UK has acted, introducing the global human rights sanctions, and has used this mechanism on a number of occasions, most recently. In respect to this particular report, as you know, it's a very serious piece of work. I've been reading it this afternoon. It would do an injustice really for me to come out straight away and comment on it. as far as what the UK thinks. But what I'm struck by, in particular, the recommendations around investigative task force, creating a role of a special representative and publishing a list of countries. What I'm struck by is the fact that the standards we states have actually created are not doing their job. There is a real gap, there is a real problem. And this report is really providing us with potential solutions. And sometimes it makes for difficult reading, because when you look at the evidence, when you look at the conclusions being put forward, it really does pose states such as ourselves a serious challenge as to what more we can be doing. So I can reassure yourself and the panel, in particular, the author of the report, Nadim Houry, that we are going to consider it very carefully. It goes without saying that the conclusions of this report are not in our gift alone to sort of bestow. We need to be working with our allies. And as you may have noted from the recent conference of the Global Media Defense Coalition, there are a huge number of states, 42 now, who are committed to this. So we need to really go away and discuss this with our allies, think about what steps we can be taking to support it, and in particular, what are the practical repercussions that these recommendations consider. So we will be doing that, and I hope that in due course, we can engage in a further discussion and see what can be done. But thank you very much again to yourself and the panel for the report and the work that you are doing.
Kanbar, thank you for that. And I'm not going to put you in the hot seat, but you've heard the challenge that's been made to you really by Keelan Gallagher, which is, you know, the role of states, particularly the states from which people who have been murdered, journalists, come, and their role in ensuring that justice is secured when a journalist like Christopher Keelan's client or the family of someone who has been murdered in Sudan, that there have to be responsibilities on the states, on the parent states of journalists who experience that. And I'm not going to ask you, you know, what are you guys doing? But I'd like you to take it away with you and to perhaps speak to some of your colleagues at the Foreign Office about having to sort of walk the talk and make sure that something might be done there. I also wanted I wanted to come to a number of questions, but before I do so, I'd like Amal to have the opportunity of coming back in, because Amal has is our deputy chair. David couldn't be here tonight, but Amal, you've been very much the energy behind so much of this work. How central is Nadim's report, which is really suggesting the creation of this task force?
Thanks. Well, you know, we have limited ourselves to 4 main proposals when it comes to ways to improve the enforcement mechanisms available internationally, and all of them, you know, formed part of a list that we discussed early on. We took it to journalists, we took it to general counsels at media organizations, and we said, you know, what else could we be recommending? What else should be done? And they sort of confirmed, no, these are the things that would make a big difference. And I know in the cases that I've worked on, if the mechanisms that we're proposing had existed, and as Keelan said in her cases, if these mechanisms existed, you know, for her client in Malta or South Sudan, it would make a big difference. So, you know, sanctions and investigations leading to prosecutions are the 2 sort of principal recommendations that we think are critical, so that there's actually a cost attached to the type of behavior we're all bemoaning and we're all extremely concerned about as supporters of democracy around the world. And I should just say, because I think Nadim was perhaps modest in omitting this, but the report has been circulated not only with states in advance, so that they could have a chance to read and digest the recommendations, but also with other organizations. And it has received an endorsement from David Kaye, the former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, as we heard today from Christoph, thank you, Ambassador Stephen Rapp from the US, representatives from the Council of Europe, from the Commonwealth Journalists Association. So, you know, I think that, as well as the sort of 14 lawyers on the panel. And so as I said, when we launched a report earlier this week, when we launch it, that's not the end, it's the beginning. We expect now to have a conversation with states, particularly those who've signed up to this pledge and said they're going to do something about attacks on journalists. And, you know, I will give an honest account sometime in 2021 about what we heard and what was done. And so, you know, we were happy to see the sanctions regime be implemented in the UK and used already in relation to press attacks in Belarus and Saudi Arabia. But you know, much remains to be done, and so we will see how far we get. But my thanks to Nadim for really putting together a brilliant report today.
I endorse that too. Now we've got a number of questions that we might just quickly try and deal with at this end game of our wonderful seminar. Someone asked, what do you do when one of the people verbally attacking journalists is the President of the United States? Well, the answer is you vote him out. And I think that we're fairly clear that it's not helpful when there's a leader of a country doing that. And we may return to some greater multilateralism and support for some of these international initiatives with the change that's taking place. But what steps can be taken, and this is a serious one, what steps can be taken to encourage states to let people in to properly investigate? I mean, you know, think of the issue of the Khashoggi murder. It takes place in Turkey at the hands of a hit squad from Saudi Arabia. Do you think that the Saudi Arabia would have opened itself up to a task force going in there and interrogating potential suspects who might have been involved? I mean, do we seriously think that that would happen? I leave that hovering in the air, that question. But are there mechanisms, Nadim?
Yes, there are really two mechanisms that the report proposes, and this is the heart of the matter. One is that these countries that have signed the media pledge have to adopt measures to facilitate the task of the investigators. We know that the borders will not open without political pressure. And that's why the report says, if you're committed to media freedom, if you're committed to protecting journalists, then you need to also use some of your political capital, hopefully multilaterally, with all these champions that come from different parts of the world. So it's not just seen as one country or two countries, to open doors. The second issue is really, and I'm hoping we're going to see a space where the UN gets re-engaged. We know it's not going to be easy, but right now there's no cost. There's zero cost right now. And I think by using the existing UN tools that have been tested and proven to work in other contexts, such as deterring other awful behavior of targeting or using children as child soldiers, it has worked in a number of cases, not always, but it has worked. So I think we have a responsibility to try, because we don't have any other alternative in any case.
Isn't one of the problems there, and I'm just going to throw this out, isn't one of the problems there that for example, the Security Council, the two nations that tend to vote against anything to do with human rights and instruments like this, Russia and China, and that it just so happens that child soldiers are not one of the things that they get up to. So that therefore they would have voted for that, and they might not be so enthusiastic about things that are relating to media freedom. I just throw that into the mix. But
I think you're right. But I think this is why I really like this word of coalition of the committed. We can no longer wait until the blockages of the Security Council are resolved. We have no idea what it's going to be like in a year or 2 years' time. And this is why, you know, the importance of this coalition of states is a return to kind of a voluntary multilateralism that should have meaning. So if things work out at the Security Council, great. But if we see the same paralysis we've seen in the past years, then it's time to see multilateral action. And frankly, having almost 40 states do that from different regions, I think will have a form of political legitimacy, because as Jan and others have said, the international law is clear. What this coalition of the committed would be doing is actually applying international law. They're not going rogue. They're actually enforcing the standards that the UN, the General Assembly, has voted for and actually repeats every year.
Can I just support that?
Yeah.
Because I think the point is, at the moment, no one's even asking the states to be let in. No one's actually knocking on the door, and it's incredibly easy for nothing to happen. You know, in the Khashoggi case, there was also then subsequently a trial which nobody could watch, and no one said much about that either. So, you know, we do have mechanisms. I agree with Nadim. If we're frustrated with lack of action from the Security Council, we can either wait around or do something else. And this idea of, you know, initially I was calling it a coalition of the willing, and then I was told by a senior British judge that it sounded like a military term, so we changed it to coalition of the committed. The point is, groups of states, or even in the case of targeted sanctions, one state can do something, and it's pretty simple. You have carrots and you have sticks. And so the EU does it with the GSP Plus program. They say, okay, do you want our aid? You have to comply with these human rights commitments. And if you don't comply, we're not going to give you that aid. And sanctions is sort of the other side of the coin. So the idea is, if the UN can't solve all these problems, why not have one or more states try and at least solve one problem at a time? And all of our recommendations are directed principally to this coalition for that reason, you know, and to the UK and Canada in particular that are leading the charge.
Now, Keelan wants to come in. Keelan has to be quite quick because we're right.
Just very quickly, I support what Nadim and Amal have said on that, but also importantly, there's a good example on that with South Sudan. And with South Sudan, you already have a UN presence. So the UN mission in South Sudan was there, in fact, had custody of his body. And I think paragraphs 189 and 190 of the report, which talk about strengthening the UN's response to investigations, critical, because in many of those states listed in Nadim's report as the worst offenders, there are UN missions in country, and if they had better expertise and guidance on initial evidence gathering, they're already there. That work could be done.
Thank you very much indeed, Keelan. Now, there's a question here, and it's a really interesting one, and it's about special mechanisms that are called anti-SLAPP mechanisms, not a term that was familiar to me from before, but it's an American mechanism that's used, and it's basically it's a mechanism for preventing abusive and unmeritorious lawsuits against journalists, particularly those who are pursuing public interest journalism and pursuing issues like corruption, political corruption, financial corruption, and so on. And there's a quick question: do we support them? I would say yes, we do. I think that generally we'll be probably looking at that in some of the other work that the high-level panel is undertaking. There's another question, which is, do the panel see any route for sanctioning lawyers or law firms who act for the claimants who bring to or threaten to bring abusive or unmeritorious lawsuits against journalists? How about that? Going after the lawyers. I'm really just putting these into the mix so that people hear them. And also a final call out for Jan Kuciak, who is a Slovakian young journalist who was killed in 2017, murdered, and again, where there has been impunity, and his killers have never been brought to justice. So there are no shortage of cases, I'm afraid, which are shocking and where we ought to be doing things. Now, I just want to mention finally that a question has been asked here is, which is really about what do we do about citizen journalists in places where journalists, are not operating because of the chilling effects of the oppressive governments that there are, and it's citizen journalists who go online and do things, but they too can end up dead. Will our processes, will we cover that group of, if you like, journalists? Will they be protected in your
The short answer is yes, definitely, and the report makes that clear. I think all the reports of the panel make that clear. We take a very wide definition of journalism that takes into account that in many countries, a lot of journalism is not being done by card-carrying journalists today. So it's actually journalists and those who accompany journalists, local fixers who often get forgotten, because also I think as we talked about today, most of journalism, particularly in war zones, is being done by freelancers. And so it's really a definition of what were they trying to do? Were they trying to capture information, transmit information, report on facts? And if so, they would definitely be covered, as well as human rights defenders. I mean, but I think this applies to all reports. I think, John, did you want to add something?
I was just going to make that point, that very point, Nadim. I mean, we as a panel have been very sensitive to the fact that we're not going to let states get away with applying very restrictive notions of what a journalist is. And all of our reports deal with those engaged in journalistic activity. And we've been very clear in all of our reports that all of our recommendations would apply with equal force to human rights defenders. As well. I just want to make that clear for the panel.
Our time is up. I want to thank my panelists. I hope you all agree with me that we've had the most fantastic group of people contributing to this discussion tonight. It really has been invigorating. The recommendation of Nadim Houry's report, endorsed by all of the panel, and getting a great deal of encouraging support from other quarters by people who are really, really engaged with these issues. And I hope that I would urge all of you who are interested in these issues to read the report and to and encourage your governments around the world to take them on board. This is really important stuff. Become part of the coalition of the committed, as Amal describes them. So thank you all. A really terrific discussion, a wonderful panel. It's been a great evening. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you
very much.